the observation deck of the Kaldrathi survey vessel. Unbroken meridians smelled of cooling mineral compounds and recycled nitrogen, and Coordinator Veth Ossian had been standing at the primary viewport for 6 minutes before he noticed the human had not stopped moving. She was on the lower track. The ship's physical conditioning loop wound around the cargo tier in a long oval, roughly 400 meters per circuit, if one followed the outer lane, and the human, specialist Elena Vasquez, on loan to the survey mission under the joint deployment protocols that Veth Ossian had himself approved without expecting to actually meet one of them, had been running since the ship reached survey transit speed. That was, he checked his implant with one secondary appendage, 41 minutes ago. He watched her pass the viewport marker again. Her form was compact and fluid. She had removed her outer layer and ran in the gray underlayer that humans favored, a close-fitted thing with pale green wicking panels at the shoulders and ribs. Her hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. Her face was composed, not strained, not the grimace expression his research files associated with significant mammalian exertion. Simply composed, as though the running were incidental to whatever she was thinking about. Veth Ossian's research files on humans were thorough by institutional standards. He had cross-referenced 4 separate taxonomic profiles, 2 intelligence assessments, and the standard Galactic Council integration report. He understood that humans were bipedal, warm-blooded, capable of moderate short-burst speed, and notable primarily for their novel battlefield psychology. Combat persistence, the files noted. Unusual pain tolerance. Acceptable environmental adaptability. The physical capability section had been brief. He watched her pass again. 43 minutes now. Naval-class survey vessels did not commonly carry human specialists. The joint deployment protocols were recent, born of the Scraith incursion aftermath, and most crew rotations had not yet cycled through an assignment that included 1. Veth Ossian's team of 7, 3 Kaldrathi, 2 Solvathi researchers, 1 Varaxian cartographer named Hel Draxis, and the junior Kaldrathi probe technician Sarah Ossian, who was his second cousin twice removed and had lobbied for the assignment with transparent enthusiasm, had received Vasquez with polite skepticism. The Solvathi pair, Dunn and Fell, had been less polite than the others, which was consistent with Solvathi institutional culture, but had nonetheless required a quiet corrective word from Veth Ossian on the first cycle. Humans were allied personnel. They would be treated accordingly. That had been 4 standard days ago. Vasquez had been quiet, capable with the survey instruments, and had eaten her rations at the communal table without complaint about the menu options, which were not designed for human dietary needs. She had said, "Thank you," when Hel Draxis adjusted one of the console heights without being asked. She had fixed the secondary probe calibration matrix on cycle 2 using what appeared to be a length of wire from her personal kit and a small multi-tool she carried on her belt, and had reported the fix to Veth Ossian with the matter-of-fact brevity of someone describing a task they performed 30 times a standard before breakfast. She had not, in 4 days, given him any reason to think about her differently than the personnel file suggested he should. Competent junior specialist, limited social footprint, asset in specific technical contexts. Then, she had started running. Veth Ossian checked his implant again. 47 minutes. He pulled up his secondary display and found the wellness monitoring tab he used for crew health tracking. Vasquez's biometric tag registered her heart rate at 162 beats per standard minute, which his reference database noted was roughly 83% of estimated maximum for a human adult of her recorded age and mass. Breathing rate elevated but stable. Skin surface temperature 2.4 degrees above her resting baseline. She was running moderately hard and had been doing so for close to 50 minutes, and her body was describing a system operating at sustained effort, not peak effort. He found that he had no reference point for this. The Caldrathi could run, of course. Explosive speed was part of their heritage, short sprint capability that had served their ancestors on the rocky highlands of their homeworld. 300 meters at full capability, and then a recovery period measured in minutes. The Solvati were poor runners on any scale. Their physiology built for aquatic environments and land movement that prioritized endurance over nothing in particular. Since the Solvati had not, historically, needed to move quickly on land when their prey was also moving slowly in shallow water. Heldraxis moved with the deliberate precision of the Phryxian build and could navigate complex terrain efficiently, but not at any speed one would call running. 51 minutes. Veth Ossian left the viewport. He found Heldraxis at the cartography console on the mid-tier, three-fingered hands moving with careful precision over a stellar mapping interface. The Phryxian was the oldest crew member by several decades and had the particular stillness of a creature who had learned that rapid movement was rarely the correct response to any situation. The vertical pupils of Heldraxis's 4 eyes tracked Veth Ossian's approach without the rest of the body moving. "She is still running," Veth Ossian said. "I am aware," Heldraxis replied without looking up. "She's been running for 51 minutes. 53 now." Heldraxis made a small adjustment to the mapping display. "I have been counting." Veth Ossian settled into the adjacent seat, which was calibrated for Caldrathi proportions and creaked slightly under his weight. "Is this normal behavior for a human?" "I have served with 2 humans previously," Heldraxis said. "In 3 standard years of joint survey work, I observed that human physical conditioning routines are longer and more frequent than comparable routines for most other species. I found it notable but not alarming. You may want to lower your alarm threshold before she finishes." "My threshold is not alarmed. I am curious." "That distinction may become less clear in approximately 40 minutes, said Heldraxis, and turned a page on the mapping interface with the serene detachment of someone who had decided this conversation was complete. Veth Ossian returned to the observation deck. He pulled a data pad from the equipment rack and brought up his accumulated research on human physiology, filtering specifically for endurance capacity. What returned was, by the standards of his institutional preparation, surprisingly sparse. The xenobiological intake profiles focused heavily on combat metrics, reaction times, strength differentials, injury recovery rates. There was a section titled Sustained Activity Tolerance that ran to 4 paragraphs, and he read it twice. The Galactic Council's Survey Commission had prepared these profiles. They were not careless documents. The researchers involved were credentialed and experienced. The section on sustained activity tolerance concluded, in language that was careful and neutral, that humans demonstrated above-average endurance for warm-blooded bipedal species. It cited the evolutionary heritage, prey pursuit adaptation on the African plains of Earth, cooling system efficiency through cutaneous moisture evaporation, which Veth Ossian understood to mean sweating, a trait he had found described elsewhere as among the more alien features of human biology. Persistence hunting as the ancestral strategy. The report noted that human distance running capacity was notable but did not, in its 4 careful paragraphs, give him a number. He wanted a number. Below, on the cargo tier track, Vasquez passed the viewport marker for the 17th time. Or was it the 18th? He had lost count. 61 minutes. He keyed the ship's general channel. Specialist Vasquez. The voice that came back was slightly elevated in breath rate, precise otherwise. Coordinator. Something you need? I am compiling crew physical capacity notes for the survey commission report. Standard documentation. What is your typical conditioning run duration? A pause. Not a long one. For a transit day? 2 hours, maybe 2.5 if I have the time. Veth Ossian looked at the data pad in his hand. The observation deck was, suddenly, very quiet. 2 hours. Give or take, I've been keeping it shorter this rotation because the cargo tier ceiling is lower than I'd like, and the turn radius on the track is tight. Affects the stride pattern. I might do 3 loops of the outer hull corridor after dinner to compensate, if you're comfortable with me accessing that section. He became aware that he had not answered for several seconds. That is... Yes, that access is approved. Thank you, Coordinator. A breath that was slightly more audible than the others. Was there anything else? No, he said. Thank you for the information. He closed the channel and stood with the data pad at his side for a moment, looking at the track below. The small figure in gray and pale green moved along the outer lane with the unhurried efficiency of something that had been built for exactly this. And Veth Ossian found himself thinking, with uncomfortable precision, that nothing in his 4 taxonomic profiles, 2 intelligence assessments, and 1 Joint Commission integration report had suggested he ought to revise his understanding of the category above average endurance. He went to find the Solvati. Dunn and Fell were in the research bay at the forward section of the ship, working a sample analysis on the spectral data from yesterday's outer system pass. They were built for efficiency in enclosed spaces. The Solvati, compact and lateral, with the wide torso and the dampened coloring that Veth Ossian had always associated with calm institutional focus. Dunn looked up. Fell did not, which was standard for Fell, who was the more senior of the pair and communicated rank primarily through selective attention. The human has been running for 63 minutes, Veth Ossian said. 64, Dunn said. You have also been watching. The biometric display is accessible from this console. Fell noticed the sustained heart rate pattern and asked me to monitor in case of a medical event. It is not a medical event, Veth Ossian said. No, Dunn agreed. It appears to be a Tuesday. Veth Ossian did not understand the reference, which was presumably a human phrase that had entered Dunn's vocabulary through some previous contact, and which Dunn had apparently decided to deploy now with the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the correct moment. Fell's dorsal fins shifted in what Veth Ossian had learned to read as dry amusement. Her personnel file notes a combat deployment record. Veth Ossian said, the Skryth incursion. Keller's Rock, Terran Station perimeter, 2 others I do not have detailed records for. In the integration report she is listed as a survey specialist. I am wondering if that classification reflects her full capability set. Dunn and Fell looked at each other in the particular way that Solvati pairs looked at each other when one of them was about to say something the other had already thought. You could ask her, Dunn said. She is running. She is also capable of conversation while running, Dunn said. I asked her to read a spectral analysis output to me from a datapad while she was on the track yesterday. She did it with no errors. I had considered it a light test of her multitasking capacity under physical load. She seemed to consider it a casual favor. Veth Ossian left the research bay. He went back to the observation deck, pulled a second chair to the viewport, and sat down. Below, Vasquez moved through her 71st minute. He watched her for a while without opening the channel. The cargo tier lighting was standard transit amber, and it caught the moisture on her shoulders and the pale green panels of her underlayer and made her look like something out of a training hollow. Specific, functional, real in a way that institutional documents were not. Her stride did not shorten, her posture did not drop. The mechanical efficiency of it was almost hypnotic, and Veth Ossian found himself thinking about the note in the xenobiological profile about persistence hunting, about how human evolutionary ancestors had run down prey animals not by being faster, but by being relentless, by running until the prey could not run anymore, until it simply stood and waited because it had no mechanism for continuing, and the human did. He thought about how that was not a technology. It was not a weapon system or a combat doctrine. It was a body, doing what bodies shaped by a particular history did when conditions demanded it. He opened the channel. Specialist Vasquez. Coordinator. Still steady. Still precise. 73 minutes. When you were stationed at Keller's Rock, he said, choosing the words with care. The Skraith incursion lasted how long? A pause in which the sound of her footfalls was audible in the channel, a rhythmic compression and release. 38 days, she said. On Keller's Rock specifically. The broader engagement ran longer. I was cycling between Rock, the Taran Station perimeter corridor, and one other post I'm not authorized to name. Call it 4 months of sustained engagement with limited resupply intervals. 4 months. Give or take. The human casualty reports from the Skraith incursion, Veth Ossian said slowly, indicated that the human contingent operated for extended periods without rotational relief. The Galactic Council observation team noted this as an anomaly. The assessment was that the human command structure had made a resource allocation error. That assessment, Vasquez said, was wrong. I am beginning to understand that. A longer pause. The footfalls. Coordinator, can I ask what's prompting the questions? I have been watching you run for 74 minutes, he said. My institutional preparation did not adequately account for what I am observing. What came back was not quite a laugh. It was a short exhalation with a specific cadence, something between acknowledgement and amusement. And it was the most human sound he had heard her make in 4 days. What did the preparation say? Above average endurance for a warm-blooded bipedal species. Another silence. The footfalls. That's technically accurate. It is also, Veth Ossian said with a precision that felt important, not remotely sufficient. No, Vasquez agreed, it usually isn't. He sat with that for a moment, watching her pass below. How much longer will you run today? Another 40 minutes, probably. Then the whole corridor loops if you've cleared that access, and then I'm done. 40 minutes. Plus the corridor. He did the arithmetic. That is approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes total. It's a transit day. I had the time. Veth Ossian closed the channel and did not move for a while. Below, the small figure in gray and pale green continued its circuit with the patient certainty of something that had been shaped by a world that did not allow stopping. Heldraxis appeared at the observation deck entrance without making a sound, which was a Vraxian habit that had startled Veth Ossian 3 times in the first cycle and now simply arrived as a fact of existence. You have the expression, Heldraxis said, settling into the second chair without asking, of someone who has just read a document they should have read 6 months ago. The integration files are inadequate. Most files are inadequate. Files are written by people who have not yet met the thing the files describe. Heldraxis looked out at the track. My first human colleague was a communications specialist. I had reviewed her personnel record before we met. The record noted she was a marathon runner. I did not know what a marathon was. I looked it up and found that it was a specific human foot race of 42.195 kilometers and assumed this was an institutional distance standard. some benchmark that the communications specialist had achieved once as a qualification marker. Veth Ossian said nothing. On the third day of our assignment, Heldraxis continued, she ran that distance on the ship's track before her duty shift. I asked her why. She said she was tapering for an upcoming event. A pause. I have thought about that word choice frequently since. Tapering. As though the appropriate way to describe running 42 kilometers before a duty shift was to characterize it as a reduced effort. What was the event she was tapering for? A 100-kilometer race she had registered for during our next port layover. She finished it in 11 hours and 42 minutes, placed in the middle of the field, and reported to duty the following morning with what she described as tight hamstrings. Veth Ossian looked at the biometric display on his secondary pad. Heart rate 159 now, 81 minutes elapsed. The integration report, he said, should have a different section title, not Sustained Activity Tolerance. Something more accurate. What would you call it? Veth Ossian thought about persistence hunting, about the African plains, about 38 days on Keller's Rock, about the word tapering. I am not sure there is a word for it in Standard Galactic, he said. The concept would have to be borrowed from a language that developed on a world where running something to exhaustion was a viable survival strategy. Heldraxis made the small sound of Vraxian contemplative agreement. They sat together in the amber light and watched Vasquez run. Sarah Ossian found them there 20 minutes later, which was how the conversation became general. The junior probe technician was 22 cycles old and had the particular energy of someone young enough to find astonishment exciting rather than unsettling. She had come to report a minor calibration flag on probe 3, delivered the report to Veth Ossian with crisp efficiency, and then looked out the viewport and said, with transparent curiosity, "Is she still going?" 91 minutes, Veth Ossian said. Sarah Ossian put the calibration report on the equipment rack and pressed her secondary appendages together in the gesture that meant she was calculating something. I ran a course simulation in the training bay last cycle, 40 minutes. I could barely close my hands afterward. That is appropriate, Heldraxis said. Kaldrathi sprint physiology is not designed for the duration she is performing. What is it designed for? Sarah said, still watching. High-velocity short engagements, Veth Ossian said. It is well suited to the contexts for which Kaldrathi historically needed speed. Humans needed something else, Sarah said. It was not a question. She had the tone of someone assembling pieces. They did. Dunn arrived 4 minutes after Sarah, ostensibly to report that the spectral analysis had completed, actually because the biometric display in the research bay had shown Vasquez at 93 minutes, and Dunn had apparently decided that watching through a viewport was preferable to watching through a console feed. Fell arrived shortly after, with no stated reason whatsoever, which was consistent with Fell's communication style on every other matter. They arranged themselves at the viewport in a rough semicircle, 4 aliens of 3 species, watching 1 human run. At 98 minutes, Vasquez slowed to a walk for the first time. Sarah made a small sound of what might have been relief, and then Vasquez walked for approximately 90 seconds, shook out her arms with the casual efficiency of someone clearing static from a circuit, and began running again. Sierra's sound changed register entirely. That was a recovery interval, Heldraxis said quietly, to no one in particular. She is not finished. She told me 2 hours, perhaps 2.5, Veth Ossian said. It has been 1 hour and 38 minutes, Dunn said. The arithmetic was not difficult. They did it collectively and in silence, and the viewport became a somewhat different object than it had been before. At 106 minutes, Vasquez opened the channel without prompting. Coordinator, heads up. I'm going to start incorporating some tempo intervals in the next lap. Heart rate's going to read high for a bit. Not a medical event. Vethosian looked at the biometric display. Heart rate, currently 155. What does high mean in this context? 180, 185. I'll bring it back down after each interval. Standard training structure. 185 beats per standard minute. He found the reference in his datapad. Estimated maximum heart rate for a human adult of her profile was 191. She was proposing, at 106 minutes of sustained running, to operate at approximately 97% of maximum cardiac output, intermittently, for training purposes. Understood, he said. He did not understand. He was beginning to, but he did not yet. The intervals began. On each one, she pushed the pace to something noticeably faster. Not a sprint, but a controlled surge. 2 minutes of elevated effort, followed by 2 minutes of recovery. And the biometric display behaved exactly as she had said it would, climbing into the 180s and descending again with the disciplined regularity of a system that knew what it was doing. The aliens at the viewport watched. None of them spoke during the first interval. During the second, Sarah said very quietly, "She is doing this on purpose." And Vethosian said, "Yes." And Sarah said, "Because she wants to." And Vethosian said, "That appears to be the case." Fell's dorsal fins were at full extension, which Vethosian had learned to read as sustained attention. At 122 minutes, Vasquez completed what appeared to be a final interval, walked for 2 minutes, and then stopped at the edge of the track near the equipment alcove. She stretched with the methodical thoroughness of someone following a protocol, touching each muscle group in sequence, holding each position for the count that her training presumably specified, and the aliens at the viewport watched her do this with the focused attention they might have given a specimen performing an unusual behavior in a field study, except that it was nothing so clinical as that. It was quieter than that. It had the quality of witnessing something and not quite having the vocabulary to record it correctly. Vethosian opened the channel. Specialist Vasquez. Coordinator. Breathing elevated, but controlled. The body in its post-effort state, but still precise. Finished for now. I'll do the corridor loops before lights down if the access is still cleared. It is cleared, he said. I wanted to ask you something. A brief pause. Go ahead. At Keller's Rock, he said. The 38 days. What was the longest continuous operational period you sustained without full rest? The pause was longer this time. Below, she was still working through the stretch sequence, methodical, unhurried. 71 hours, she said. There was an engagement that required sustained positional coverage and we were short on personnel. 71 hours of active patrol and response work. I slept 6 hours after and was back on rotation. 5 of the 6 beings at or near the viewport made some involuntary physical response to this. Dunn's lateral fins compressed. Sarah's secondary appendages closed. Hell Draxus was still, which in Vraxian emotional vocabulary was itself a response. Fell's dorsal fins held at full extension and did not move at all. Vethosian was aware that he had produced a sound, a low exhale through his nasal slits, that was the Kaldrathi equivalent of sitting down unexpectedly. The Galactic Council Observation Team, he said with care, noted in its assessment that the human contingent appeared to operate on an unsustainable schedule. The report recommended a review of human military staffing protocols with an eye toward preventing burnout-related casualties. I read that report, Vasquez said. I imagine the assessment was frustrating. The word I used at the time was different, she said. But yes, a beat. We weren't on an unsustainable schedule. We were on a human schedule. The council observers were using Vraxian endurance thresholds as their baseline, because that was the closest analogous data set they had. Vraxian is a reasonable baseline for a lot of species. It's not a reasonable baseline for humans. What would a reasonable baseline look like? The stretch sequence continued below. She reached down to hold an angle that her lower body apparently required, and held it, and said, with the flat precision that he had already come to understand as her particular register, "The human military has a concept called the Long March. It comes from our history, from periods when armies needed to move faster than the enemy expected was possible. The record, the longest march in documented human military history, was 160 kilometers in 40 hours. Infantry soldiers, carrying equipment, over rough terrain." Nobody said anything. That was considered extreme, she said. An emergency measure, not standard practice. A pause in which she moved to the next stretch position. Standard practice was considerably shorter. I'm not citing the extraordinary to define the ordinary. I'm citing it to establish what the envelope looks like. Veth Ossian thought about the word envelope. He thought about Heldraxis's colleague in the word tapering. He thought about the gap between what files said and what things were. The council assessment, he said, has been used in 3 subsequent joint deployment policy discussions to argue for limiting human military assignments to shorter rotation windows. The argument is welfare-based, preventing exploitation of human personnel. I know, Vasquez said. We've been in those discussions. She came up from the stretch, rolled her neck once, and looked up at the observation deck viewport with the direct, unapologetic attention of someone who had known for some time that she was being watched. The welfare concern is not wrong, Coordinator. Humans have limits. Humans get tired. Humans need sleep and food and recovery time. What the policy gets wrong is where the limits actually are. It's drawing the line based on where other species' limits are and assuming we share the same profile. You do not, Veth Ossian said. No, she said. We don't. He looked at the 5 beings arranged around him, all of them oriented toward the viewport, all of them carrying some version of the same expression, which was the expression of institutional frameworks undergoing revision in real time. Sarah had both of her primary appendages pressed flat against the viewport frame. Dunn's dorsal was compressed and still. Fell had not moved in 12 minutes. When I submit my survey commission report, Veth Ossian said, there is a section for crew performance notes. I will need to revise my preliminary entry for your profile. What did you have? Competent junior specialist, limited social footprint, asset in specific technical contexts. The sound she made was the same as earlier, the short exhalation with the specific cadence, something between acknowledgement and amusement, but this time it was fuller, less contained. That's thorough. It was accurate as of 4 days ago. It is less accurate now. What will you put? He looked at the data pad in his hand, at the sparse 4 paragraphs of the Galactic Council's best attempt at describing what he had spent the last 2 hours watching. I am not certain my current vocabulary is adequate, he said. I may need to request clarification from the Xenobiological Survey Commission on what descriptive framework they intended when they wrote above average endurance for a warm-blooded bipedal species. That'll be a short conversation, she said. I suspect so. She picked up her outer layer from the equipment alcove, unfolded it with the economical motions of someone who was already thinking about the next thing, and slung it over one shoulder. I'm going to get some water and then do the corridor loops. 40 minutes, maybe 45. I'll stay clear of the research bays. The crew is aware of your routine, Veth Ozian said. I do not think proximity will be an issue. She looked up at the viewport again. The amber transit lighting was behind her, and it made her look, for a moment, like something from a very long way back. Something shaped by conditions that none of the beings watching her had ever been close to. Something that carried, in its build, in its breathing, and its unhurried efficiency, the blueprint of a history that did not end when the stars became accessible. Thank you, she said, and she meant it plainly without ceremony, and she walked toward the corridor access without looking back. The observation deck was quiet for a while after she left. Sarah broke it first. She was young enough that she did it without self-consciousness. 71 hours, she said. Yes, Veth Ozian said. And then 6 hours of sleep and back on rotation. Yes. The council thought that was unsustainable. The council was using the wrong baseline, Veth Ozian said. He looked at the door through which Vasquez had gone, then at the track below, empty now, and still carrying in his mind's eye the shape of her moving through it with the patience of something that did not understand stopping. They were asking whether she was being pushed beyond her limits. They were not asking where her limits actually were. Hel Draxis said, with the measured quiet of 4 decades of survey work, that is the question the integration reports should have asked from the beginning. It is the question I will be asking the Commission to add to future profiles, Veth Ozian said. He set the datapad down on the equipment rack. The biometric display showed Vasquez's heart rate descending into the recovery range, 120, 115, dropping with the disciplined efficiency of a system returning to standby, not because it was done, but because it had calibrated exactly how much rest it needed before the next demand. Sarah, the calibration flag on probe 3. Walk me through the details. Yes, Coordinator. Sarah retrieved the report from the rack. Professional again, the astonishment packed away for later. The secondary sensor array showed a 0.3 deviation in the depth mapping calibration during the outer system pass. I've isolated it to the 3rd emitter in the port side cluster. Vasquez's wire fix on the calibration matrix may have shifted the load distribution slightly. Can it be corrected in the current transit window? Yes. It's a 10-minute adjustment if the parts bay has the right gauge coupling. Check the parts bay and report back. He paused. If you need assistance with the adjustment, Specialist Vasquez is available after her corridor run. Her personnel file notes 17 months of field maintenance experience. Sarah blinked all 4 eyes in the rapid succession that was the Caldrathi expression for recalibration. Yes, Coordinator. I'll check the parts bay. The crew dispersed. Hel Draxis returned to the cartography console. Dunn and Fell went back to the research bay. Veth Ozian sat in the observation chair and looked at the empty track for a while, and then he opened the biometric display and pulled up the full historical record for the day's session. The graph of Vasquez's heart rate over 2 hours and 19 minutes, including the corridor work that was currently accumulating data at 140 beats per standard minute. Steady, and even as a tide. He began drafting his commission report note. He deleted the first 3 attempts because they were either too sparse or too clinical or contained, in one case, language that he could not source to any approved descriptive framework and therefore could not use officially. The 4th attempt read, "The existing integration profile for human physical endurance capacity is insufficient for mission planning purposes. The profile's characterization of human endurance as above average for warm-blooded biped species implies a similarity of kind that does not reflect field observation. A revised framework should consider that human endurance capacity is not a moderate elevation above standard interstellar baseline, but a qualitatively distinct trait with its own historical architecture. Further xenobiological study is recommended before the current joint deployment policy discussions are finalized. He read it twice. It was not quite adequate. No document would be entirely, but it was accurate, which was what documents were for, and it pointed toward the question rather than away from it, which was the best a document could do. 41 minutes after she had gone to the corridors, the biometric display showed Vasquez's heart rate dropping into full recovery range. And then, a few minutes after that, she appeared at the door of the observation deck in dry clothes. Hair still damp from what the ship's water usage log would later show was a 6-minute shower, carrying a protein ration and a data pad. She looked at Veth Ossian in the chair, made a mild assessment of his presence, and said, "Is probe 3 giving you trouble?" "Sarah is addressing it," he said. "She may come to you with a parts bay question." "I'll be in the research bay in an hour. She can find me there." She moved to sit at the secondary console with the ease of someone who had measured the space and knew exactly where she fit. "Anything on the spectral analysis worth flagging?" "Dunn and Fell have a preliminary result. Nothing anomalous." "Good." She opened the protein ration with a crisp efficiency and took a bite without looking at it, already reading something on the datapad, and for several minutes they were simply 2 crew members at the end of a transit day in the amber light of the observation deck, and the ship moved through the dark between stars. Then, Vasquez said, without looking up from the datapad, "You know what the commission is going to do with your report note." "They will file it," Veth Ossian said, "and possibly cite it in the next policy discussion." "They'll cite it the way they cite everything that complicates the framework," she said. "They'll note it as an individual observation pending broader confirmation. They'll say one survey coordinator's field notes are not sufficient to revise a council-approved integration profile. That is," Veth Ossian said, "a fair characterization of the Commission's procedural habits." "So what do you do?" He looked at the biometric display still cycling, Vasquez's resting heart rate a clean 54 beats per standard minute, lower than his own by 8, lower than the Solvati pair's by 12. "I submit the note," he said. "And in 6 months, when the survey rotation completes and the crew rotation brings someone new, I brief them before they read the file. And they brief the next person, until the file catches up with what the people who have met her already know." Vasquez looked up from the datapad. Her expression was the composed, quiet one he had cataloged 4 days ago as her default, but there was something in it that had not been there 4 days ago, or perhaps had been there and he had not had the equipment to read it. "That works," she said. "It is slow," he said. "Most things that matter are," she said, and went back to the datapad. Veth Ossian submitted the commission note. He closed the biometric display. Outside the viewport, the stars were fixed and cold, and the ship moved between them. And somewhere in the forward corridor, Sarah Ossian was checking a parts bay for a gauge coupling, and in the research bay, Dunn and Fell were compiling a spectral analysis. And at the secondary console, a human specialist was eating a protein ration and reading field data with the calm efficiency of someone who had covered 2 hours and 59 minutes of ground today and expected to cover more tomorrow, because tomorrow was also a day and days were what she was built for. 3 standard months later, a brief message arrived in Veth Ossian's commission inbox from an address he did not immediately recognize. The subject field contained no words, only a routing number from the Terran station relay. The body of the message read, "Thought you'd want to know. The policy discussion panel convened last week. Your note was cited. They used the phrase, individual observation pending broader confirmation, exactly as you predicted. There are now 11 other coordinators on record with similar notes from the past 18 months. They're calling a review." V. He read it twice. He opened a reply window and wrote 2 sentences. "Thank you for the update. I will file this in the appropriate record." Then he deleted the second sentence because it was not what he meant and wrote instead, "Thank you for the update. I hope the next survey rotation gives you a track with better ceiling height." He sent it and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office and thought about a graph of a heart rate over 2 hours and 19 minutes, steady and even and entirely unhurried, and found that the thought produced something that was close to, but not quite reassurance. The particular residue of understanding, something you had not understood before, and knowing the understanding was still incomplete, and knowing also that this was appropriate, because the thing you were trying to understand had been shaped by conditions you had never encountered and was not obligated to fit the frameworks you had brought to it. 11 other coordinators. A review convened. The file, slowly, beginning to catch up. He closed the message and went back to work.